Well, good morning, everybody. How are you on this, the 24th day of January 2025? I'm Rick Tallent, your host. You're watching Manna in the Morning. This is the daily broadcast of Rick Tallent Ministries and Grace Fellowship Church of Lafayette, Georgia. We're going to talk about the subject of communications today. And this may not sound as spiritual as some of our little sessions, but I feel like it's important that we kind of get a grasp on the thing about communications. I've been involved in the communications industry my entire life. As a little boy, I had a transistor radio given to me, and I've told the story many times. If I'm repeating myself, just bear with me. But when I was about 8 or 9 years old, my sister gave me a little transistor radio for Christmas. And I played that thing, and I figured out, I acquired me a battery eliminator is what they called it back then. So I could plug it into the wall, that little bitty transistor radio. And it only picked up AM. But late at night, I would lay in my bed and listen to stations like WLW and WWL and WABC, WNBC, WCBS, all these big, powerful stations, KDKA and others, these big, powerful 50,000 watt stations. And listen to everything from news to Wolfman Jack. And that probably brings back a few memories for some of you. But that started me on a lifetime of working in radio and television. And I'm now 69 years old. I'm not going to rush the date by saying I'm not. I won't be for another 5 months. 50 years working radio and television, around radio stations, television stations, doing everything from on air to being the engineer and the general manager, and in a couple of cases, even the owner of the station. And the history of electronic communications is something that I find fascinating, and I want to share just some of these headlines with you. And just kind of give you an idea of where we've come from in such a short period of time, and how it has just mushroomed in times. Okay, let's. Do you remember Johannes Gutenberg? He was a printer. And when he did printing, he had to carve out each individual page out of a wooden block. And he slipped and had an accident one day and cut a wooden block the wrong way. And he began to cut it up into pieces. And he realized that he didn't have to cut an entire wooden block for every page anymore. He didn't have to carve every little letter. He could make interchangeable letters and stack them up and bundle them up, and movable type was invented. In my youth, I actually used a letterpress in my cousin Ira Johnson's printing shop in Lenoir City, Tennessee. I know how to set type in a letterpress and how to use a letterpress. I know how to use an offset press. We've gone from that to from where a letterpress was, in my lifetime, still a viable and well-used piece of equipment, to where we have a copier in the office that was given to this ministry. It was a donation by a dear friend, that I can communicate with it by computer and use it as a printer. It's full color. It'll do both sides of the piece of paper. It will scan. It will save it to electronic memory. It will do all kinds of things. You can print books on the thing. although we don't try to do that. But that printer is a technological wonder, all the things that it can do. So we've gone from that with Gutenberg to where we are today. In fact, the cover art for one of my books that's fixed to come out was printed on that copier. You see that? That's beautiful, isn't it? I might as well show you the other one. There's the cover of the other one. We have come so far. And yesterday, I received a message from a preacher in India who was commenting on Manna in the Morning. And brother, feel free to use my YouTube page. If you're watching this broadcast, feel free to use the videos from the YouTube page to share with your congregation. These are about communicating the word of God to people. But I jump ahead of myself. In 1729, a fellow by the name of Stephen Gray discovered that electricity could be transmitted over large distances using wires as long as they were insulated. That was 1729. It was 71 years later that the electric battery was invented. But the problem was the guy invented it and there was no practical application for it. There was no use for it. In 1834, Charles Wheatstone experimented with the rate of transmission of electricity along a half mile of insulated copper wire. In 1837, Samuel Morse showcased his telegraph. And then in 1838, he demonstrated a new and improved telegraph which used what was called Morse code, which Morse code is simply the alphabet given a code of dots and dashes, of short duration switch closures and long duration switch closures. That in 1838 was the beginning of the digital computer. Do you realize that? Because instead of it being the spoken word, it was every letter of the alphabet converted into a code. And then that code could be transmitted. I remember as a kid, and I wish I had thought about this earlier, I would have built one. We used to build telegraphs out of some blocks of wood, some screws, and little pieces of sheet metal, and some wire, and nails. And we would use those telegraphs to send and receive Morse code. And we learned Morse code as a result. That was when I was a kid. And it was such a wonderful little toy. We built it ourselves. We didn't buy it at the store. We built it ourselves. Out of some blocks of wood, some screws, some nails, some wire, and some little strips of tin. And in doing so, I didn't realize it at the time, but we were building our own relay. Because a relay is nothing but a coil that closes a circuit by electromagnetic, by an electromagnetic force causing a metal bar to close a switch. So the telegraph with Samuel Morse and what we know as Morse code, 1838. In 1851, there were we're talking about 13 years later, there were 51 telegraph companies in operation. What a massive, massive change in communication. Now you didn't have to write it down and send a courier on horseback to deliver a message. You could take your message to an office and a man would sit there and type it in to the telegraph using Morse code, and instantaneously, instantaneously, miles away, tens of miles away, hundreds of miles away, that message was delivered and received. What a transformation of communications. Now news that happened in New York City that would have to be printed or written, handwritten, and then delivered by horseback or stagecoach might take weeks to get somewhere. Now, through the use of the telegraph, as long as they had telegraph wires going to that place, the news could be sent almost instantaneously. It was a laborious process. Hand sending every letter one at a time. But it was far faster than riding a horse 100 miles. We don't think anything of driving 100 miles. It's over 100 miles from where I live to Knoxville, Tennessee. Don't think anything about going to Knoxville or going to Atlanta, which is another 100 miles. When I lived in Southeast Texas, there were people that would drive from Beaumont to Houston for dinner. And that's 100 miles. Or would drive 45 miles from Orange to Lake Charles to eat. Didn't think anything about it. But in the day and time of the telegraph, when it was invented, that was horseback or by buggy or wagon or stagecoach. Or maybe the early train. But it still took time to go there. But this electronic communication, this electrical communication was changing things. Then something called the Morse inker was invented, which was an ink pen attached to a telegraph key so that when the received message was there, you hand cranked a roll of paper tape and it would print out the Morse code image. So the Morse code could be recorded. That was in 1860. 1866, they laid a transatlantic cable between New York and London. And then in 1876, we're talking about 50 years. Let's see. No, we're not even talking that. We're talking about 35 years after the invention of the telegraph. Came Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone. And then in 1901, Marconi did the unthinkable. He transmitted a radio signal wirelessly, what became known as radio, between Cornwall, England, and Newfoundland across the North Atlantic. That was in 1901. It was 14 years later, 13 years later in 1914, that wireless and wired telegraphy were used for communication in World War I. In 1924, 23 years after Marconi used radio signals successfully for the first time, he made the first telephone call to Australia using radio waves. And then, within just a couple of years, the telegraph company and the wireless telegraph companies combined to form communications companies. 1940. 1940. We're talking 100 years after the telegraph. The first police FM radio communication was set up in Hartford, Connecticut. And in 1944, a telephone submarine cable was laid across the English Channel, connecting Great Britain and France. And in 1950, you ready for this? 100 let's see here. Yeah. 112 years after the invention of the telegraph, it became obsolete as the telephone took over. That's 1950. 1957, 7 years later, the Russians launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. And it transmitted low-frequency radio signals. In 1960, the laser was invented. In 1962, NASA launched Telstar. And that's when the first non-public, then later public television television was transmitted by Telstar between Europe and the United States. By that time, the television and radio had become the standards of communications. And then in 1972, two guys invented computer communication by TCP. And those computer people at work. And ever since then, it's been computers wiring. On up through today. We're talking about less than 200 years ago, 190 years ago, when the telegraph was invented and Morse code was invented, to where we are today, where I'm communicating right now around the world, sending a video picture, a video image, an audio image, an audio message from my home. This is from a corner of my office. I have multiple computers here. There's even a television set over here that has off-air television coming out of Chattanooga, hooked up to an antenna. Think about this for a moment. Do you remember these record albums? I have hundreds of them. Hundreds of them, trust me. That was the standard back 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Reel-to-reel tape was replaced by, and this will tell you how long I've been in the ministry, audio cassettes. And these are audio cassettes of some of my sermons from years and years ago. In fact, here's a whole tape series entitled The Anointing, the Ministry of Trials, and the 5 Blessings of Praise. If you'd like those on CD, we have them available, as well as a bunch of others. In fact, here is a CD of a message that I preached on October 18th, 1985 at Evangel Tabernacle. And it's been dubbed from a cassette over to a CD. You see what I'm talking about? Do you remember these? This is mine, okay? You remember this? Breaker 19. CB radio. Still popular as all get out. I was talking with a buddy of mine the other night who is thinking about setting him up a prayer chain on a CB radio channel. A prayer network. You know what he's going to do? He's going to hook up a CB. He's going to start telling people, look, come together every night, 7 o'clock on this frequency, on this channel, and share your prayer request. And sometimes we'll even share testimonies. And anybody can listen because it's the public airwaves. And anybody can join. And within about 10 or 15 miles of where he is, easily 10 or 15 miles, there'll be people that will be praying together, sharing prayer requests, sharing testimonies. You remember those dots and dashes of Morse code? We call it ASCII, ASCII. That's the same language, but it's computers that do it now. This video signal is computer data. That's the same thing as Morse code, except it's just super high speed. And it's going around the world. Yesterday morning, a pastor was watching this broadcast in India. He was watching it live around the world. Why am I talking about all this stuff? This hard drive is loaded down with television programs. Some of it's gospel music, some of it's my sermons. But this hard drive can be put into a computer, and we have a computer that does this at the church. And literally, we can play back those programs off of this hard drive onto the internet and rebroadcast those sermons around the world. If you go to my YouTube page, Rick Tallent, at Rick Tallent 8748, you'll find there's over 1,000 videos of me teaching and preaching. Why am I talking about all this stuff? Why is this so important? Why is it important? Every day that I possibly can, I'm on the internet sharing the gospel, sharing the word of God, sharing testimonies, teaching, preaching. And the whole purpose of it is to communicate to the entire world the message of Jesus Christ, the gospel message. I sit at a computer and I write. And right here's 4 novels, 4 books. They're fixing to go to the publisher. They're sitting on top of a VCR. Do you remember what those are? Video cassette recorder. I've got piles of music over here. I've got stacks and stacks of it at the church. I've got stacks and stacks of videotapes. Why am I talking about all this? Because all of these things are tools of communication. They are tools of communication. And what is communication? It is sending a message from point A to point B, or point C or point D or point E or point F or point Z. They're not the ministry. They may be miracles because it means that man has learned how to send messages around the world. And the most important message we can send around the world is the message of new life through Jesus Christ. Why do I do this? I'm at an age when most guys are retiring, sitting back and enjoying retirement. What am I doing? I'm starting another church, starting another radio station, continuing to teach and preach every day that I possibly can, encouraging others to do the same thing. But why am I doing it? Because the message that we need to communicate needs to go out to the whole world so that whosoever will receive it and be saved, and that their eternity will be changed. Their destination for eternity will be changed. Communication. We can't be an island out to ourselves and just isolate ourselves. We got to tell somebody. We got to tell somebody what Jesus means to me. That's communication. All of these things I've shown you, all these things I've talked about are just means of communication. They are not the ministry, but we can sure pick up that CB radio microphone or that ham radio microphone, and we can communicate with people. We can talk to people about the gospel without ever leaving our living room. And we can reach people. You see, ministry is where you find the means of communication. And that's what it boils down to. When you discover a means of communication where you can reach out to someone else with the most important message that we could ever share. You remember? Breaker 19. Let me interrupt your life and tell you about the most important thing that you will ever hear. Until next time, this is Rick Tallent saying, go with God, because he has already gone before you and prepared the way. He is your rear guard, and no matter what happens, he will always be there by your side. And one more quick note, there's more computing power in this telephone that I carry than what it took to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely.